Understanding the biochemical environment of the human body is critically important if we're going to really be able to conceptualize and understand any of the biochemical or physiological processes that occur within the body. So let's start with a look at this. We're going to talk about atoms, ions, molecules, cells, and the fluid compartments within the body. So let's take a look at this periodic table of elements, which can be a pretty frightening thing to look at, especially for any chemistry major students. For us, it's not going to be that big a deal because we're not going to memorize this whole table. But it's useful to take a look at some of these elements or atoms within the table as they are a big part of our body. So up in the top left here, we have hydrogen. This is the hydrogen atom. And then over here to the right, we have carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. And carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, in addition to hydrogen, are the prevailing atoms within our body. There's certainly others, but they make up the overwhelming majority of atomic particles within our body. While we are at this periodic table of elements, let's take a look at some of these atoms that actually become ions and play significant parts in our body as solutes, salts, and ions. So right here, for example, we have sodium. The sodium ion is significantly important. Right below it, we have potassium. The potassium ion plays a huge part in all cells of the body. So sodium and potassium are significantly important to the functioning of our cells. And these become ions because they lose electrons and they gain a positive charge. Right next to potassium, we see calcium. Calcium plays a huge part in muscle contraction, among other things. Above that, we see magnesium. And then over on the right, we see chlorine. That's the chlorine atom. When it becomes ionized, it becomes the chlorine ion, otherwise known as chloride. Okay, so let's just review. We had carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and those are our prevailing atoms within our body. And then, like I said, there's the associated ions, sodium, potassium, calcium, and chloride. Sodium, potassium, and calcium are what are known as cations. They are positively charged ions. Calcium, on the other hand, is an anion. It is a negatively charged ion. So any positively charged ion is a cation. Any negatively charged ion is an anion. And to be clear, we do have molecular anions as well, and we'll look at that. Molecules are created by the binding of atoms via covalent bonds. The most prevalent molecule in the body is water, H2O. So this is showing two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom. And H2O is pretty unique because it's not only a molecule, it is a substance. So as we see in this glass of water to the left, that's a substance of water. And that water is going to have millions, dare I say billions, of water molecules within it. So water is both a substance and a molecule. Over here to the left, O2, that's a diatomic molecule, meaning it has two atoms, in this case, two oxygen atoms, and that is the molecule of oxygen. We have carbon dioxide, which is CO2. Oxygen plays a significant part in the process of cellular respiration, producing the energy storage molecule of ATP. CO2 is a byproduct of that. So don't worry too much about that, but they play part and parcel with each other in that process. Down here on the left, we have glucose, which is the main fuel that's broken down to produce ATP. We will talk extensively about glucose in this class. And then there's two molecules up here, carbonic acid, and below it, bicarbonate. These are molecules, atoms bound to each other via covalent bonds, which is sharing of electrons. The only difference between carbonic acid and bicarbonate is bicarbonate, as you may see, only has one hydrogen atom, whereas carbonic acid has two. Bicarbonate, by losing that hydrogen atom, now has a negative charge, and that's what we refer to as a molecular anion. It's a negatively charged molecule. Now, one thing I do want to add to this is, why is that negatively charged when it loses the hydrogen? And that's because hydrogen is generally in the ionic form, that is to say, H+. We will often, and I will often, refer to the hydrogen ion merely as a proton, because that's what it is. It is lost an electron, and all it has is the proton. Certainly it's going to have the neutron, but the neutron is negligible, hence the name neutron. So oftentimes when you see H+, it's going to be referred to as a proton. Nonetheless, by carbonic acid losing that proton, it now, bicarbonate, has that negative charge. Here I want to just take a brief tour of a cell. Not all cells are circular like this, though I tend to draw them like this. Around the perimeter of the cell is the plasma membrane, otherwise known as the cell membrane. It's composed of a phospholipid bilayer, which we will look at in detail in a subsequent video. Within the cell is the cytosol, which is the fluid component of the interior of the cell that actually occupies the space known as the cytoplasm. Within the cytosol, we have organelles that have specific functions. I'm not going to go over all of those, but the ones of immediate importance to us is the nucleus, which houses the genetic material, otherwise known as the DNA, the mitochondria, which produces that energy storage vehicle known as ATP. There's another organelle that we don't see here known as the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which in some cases synthesizes and stores lipids, but it also, in other cases, such as in muscle cells, stores and releases calcium. And that will be significantly important in understanding a number of downstream processes related to muscle contraction. So the smooth endoplasmic reticulum stores calcium, the mitochondria produces ATP, and the nucleus houses the genetic material, otherwise known as DNA. Okay, so now let's talk about the fluid compartments within the body. We have intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid. Intracellular fluid is synonymous with the cytosol, the fluid within cells, the fluid that's confined within the plasma membrane of cells. Outside of cells, we have extracellular fluid. Any fluid that's not within cells, any fluid that's outside of cells, makes up the extracellular fluid. And that includes the interstitial fluid, and I'll show a diagram or an image of that in a second. Blood plasma, any fluid flowing through blood vessels is known as the blood plasma. That is part of the extracellular fluid. Serous fluid is important throughout the body, specifically around the heart and lungs and the peritoneal cavity. There are membranes that are separated and adjoined to each other, and I realize that was confusing, but it does both. But between those membranes, we find serous fluids like pericardial fluid, pleural fluid, what have you. Those make up part of the extracellular fluid. Any fluid that's not within cells is extracellular fluid. Fluid of our joints, like synovial fluid, is part of the extracellular fluid. The fluid in our eye, vitreous humor and aqueous humor, is part of the extracellular fluid. The only fluid that is not part of extracellular fluid is the cytosol of the cell, and that is intracellular fluid. Intracellular fluid makes up 2/3 of all body fluids, whereas extracellular fluid makes up 1/3. In this image right here, it's a very simple image. These rectangular structures in green are representing cells. The pink or purple structure is a blood vessel. Anywhere you see white, that is interstitial space that has interstitial fluid. So anything outside of these cells, so the darker green line would be the cell membrane. Anything outside of it, the white here, even the small bits of white between the cells, contains interstitial fluid. The interstitial fluid within the interstitial space, plus the blood plasma in the blood vessels, specifically in this case, a capillary, the blood plasma and the interstitial fluid make up a great majority of the extracellular fluid. And the last thing I want to talk about are some specific type of molecules that we refer to as biomolecules, and they include carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Carbohydrates can be split up into complex carbohydrates and simple carbohydrates. Complex carbohydrates include things like starch and glycogen, which are storage forms of glucose in plants and animals. Glucose is a simple carbohydrate, specifically a monosaccharide that animals, including humans, use for a source of energy to produce ATP. So going back to the complex carbohydrates, glycogen is the storage form of glucose in animals. Starch is the storage form of glucose in plants. While we're not plants, they are relevant to us because we eat plants for nutrients. And if we don't eat plants for nutrients, we eat animals that eat plants. So starch is important for our livelihood. Simple carbohydrates, once again, are monosaccharides like glucose, fructose, and galactose, and disaccharides such as sucrose, maltose, and lactose. Lipids are going to include phospholipids that make up the cell membrane or the plasma membrane, steroids, which are often the substrate used to make hormones, or many of the hormones at least, or other signaling molecules, and fats also are a type of lipid. Nucleic acids are DNA and RNA, which are genetic material, and ATP, that energy storage vehicle that I keep referring to and we will talk about endlessly throughout this term. ATP is also a nucleic acid. If you don't know what type of biomolecule something is in the body, it's probably going to be a protein, because most things in our body are proteins. Hormones are proteins, enzymes are proteins, channels are proteins, pumps, muscles, what have you. Insulin, which is a hormone released from the pancreas to control blood sugar levels, is a protein. Collagen, which is a structural molecule, is a protein. And collagen is the most ubiquitous protein throughout the body. Hemoglobin, found within red blood cells that helps transport oxygen and to a lesser degree carbon dioxide, is a protein. Muscles are made out of myofilaments that are composed of proteins. So those are the biomolecules and the biochemical environment of our body.